Finally, pollution. Anyone who lives in or near a city knows what a nuisance it can be. It's one of the things you're glad to leave behind when you get out into the country. If in fact you can leave it behind. The beauty of a Norwegian forest, pure water, clean air, the ideal place for a relaxing holiday. Well, you certainly could have a marvellous holiday here, but unfortunately neither the air nor the water are quite as pure as they appear, and the Norwegians themselves are certainly not relaxed about the situation. The sad truth is that despite the picture postcard scenery, even areas as remote and beautiful as this are affected by modern industrial pollution. Conditions vary from day to day, depending on the strength and direction of the prevailing winds. But if you went out for a stroll in that romantic-looking mist hanging over the trees round the lake, the chances are that you'd be breathing in a dilute form of sulphuric acid. It wouldn't be enough to harm you. The amounts are far too small to affect humans directly. But the acid is there, and it's enough to corrode metal, enough to kill fish. In recent years, trout and salmon have been dying in Norway's rivers and lakes at an alarming rate, especially in the south. In West Telemark, for example, a survey was performed on 153 lakes that had once been well stocked with fish. Only 2 of them still contained any. In the 151 others, they had disappeared completely, wiped out, say the Norwegians, by excess acidity caused by polluted air. The question is, where is the pollution coming from? Not from here, claim the Norwegians. And it's certainly true that the worst hit areas are well away from major towns and factories. In Norway's view, this pollution's a long-distance traveller, and most, if not all, has come from the industrial centres of Europe, carried to Scandinavia by the prevailing winds. It happens when fossil fuel such as coal or oil is burned, especially in large plants such as this in Western Germany. Tall chimneys throw sulphur-laden exhaust high into the air, but it doesn't just disappear. One of the worst offenders, according to Norway, is Britain, especially British power stations. Britain does accept that long-range pollution is taking place, and British scientists are working with their Norwegian counterparts. But so far, there's no agreement on how to share out the blame. It's the mountainous areas of southern Norway that are most exposed to the fumes blown across from Europe, and the Norwegians have put a lot of effort into finding out just how much is arriving. The chemical process is like this. Sulphur dioxide, a colourless, poisonous gas, dissolves in rain or in groundwater to produce sulphurous acid. This, in its turn, combines with oxygen to produce sulphuric acid, a corrosive poison. The heaviest precipitations arrive in the autumn, when they fall as acid rain. But winter's the crucial time, because they then fall as snow, and instead of being immediately dispersed throughout the water system, they build up over the winter months. In spring, when the snow starts to melt, a layer of concentrated impurities is released in a poisonous flood. Norway's been collecting data on the subject for many years, and it's been carrying out various programs of intensive research over the last decade. One of the laboratories that's most involved is the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, a semi-governmental body situated on the outskirts of Oslo. Routine tests like these measure the pH, or acidity, of water samples. The lower the pH value, the higher the acidity, and the greater the damage to plant and fish life. It's the freshwater fish that are most vulnerable because the peak of acidity in spring coincides with their hatching and spawning period. The effects of excess acid can be seen in this laboratory experiment on brown trout eggs. It's not just a question of acidity. The water's normal balance of minerals is also disrupted. As natural salts in the eggs are taken by the water, the eggs lose nourishment and the fish die. It's just the same with mature fish as with the eggs or the young fry. In acid waters, fish grow more slowly, partly as a result of changes in their own body chemistry, and partly because acid waters tend to contain less food. This is a brook trout, a North American fish. Norwegian scientists are experimenting with it at the moment because they believe it may prove more resistant to acidity than Norway's native brown trout. Even more worrying for the Norwegian economy is the effect of acidity on salmon, whose numbers have been dropping steadily since the 1920s. The person whose job it is to worry about these problems is Norway's Minister for the Environment, Mrs. Gro Harlem Brundtland.
The southern parts of Norway and Sweden are greatly affected by the deposition of acidity from the atmosphere being carried by the winds from other parts of Europe. It is damaging and acidifying our streams and lakes, causing depletion of fish stocks and damage to nature otherwise. It's difficult to quantify in economic terms this kind of ecological damage of nature, but it can give an idea of the extent of the economic problem caused by pollution when you know that in the United States a reduction in the sulfur dioxide pollution in their cities caused a reduction in the cost of corrosion and material damage from $900 million a year down to less than 100. It gives us knowledge that also the economy of causing pollution can be a great problem to our countries.
How much of this pollution comes from Norway itself and how much from abroad?
There have been studies under the OECD trying to quantify the amount coming from different areas. Seen from Norway, we know that between 50 and 90% of all pollution of sulfur dioxide that is deposited on our land comes from outside sources. And in the worst affected areas, 90% come from abroad.
And who are the main culprits?
It comes from both Eastern and Western Europe, but due to the prevailing winds, maybe around 50% comes from Great Britain.
Are you confident that you have proved your case to scientists elsewhere in Europe?
Yes, I think now that most scientists agree that the cause of acidification of Norwegian and Swedish streams are due to acid precipitation. It was proven during a long study that has been carried out both in Norway and Sweden and in an international conference of experts carried through in Norway in the county of Telemark in June last year.
In its determination to prove its case, Norway's had to launch an environmental research program on a scale that's unprecedented in such a small nation. Between 50 and 60 scientists are engaged on the project full-time, and the whole 7-year operation will cost the equivalent of more than $10 million US. Monitoring stations across the country sample the rain so that its acid content can be checked against what would be normal for Norway's own sulphur emissions. In areas like this, claim the Norwegians, local pollution can account for less than 10% of the acidity found. Constant manning isn't possible in the remote areas, so devices like this are used to take samples of rainfall round the clock. Each sample is kept separate, so it can be compared with the known wind speed at the time. Most scientists agree that Norway has now accumulated an impressive amount of data on acid precipitation, and these and other findings have been made the subject of a major investigation by the Organization for European Cooperation and Development. The OECD's report should have been made available towards the end of last year, but politically the subject is something of a hot potato, so the report's been delayed and is unlikely to appear until the end of this year. Politics haven't been the only stumbling block, though. Some scientists, and the British in particular, claim that the picture is more complex than it's often been presented. They admit that Europe has got dirtier. Since 1950, the amount of sulphur dioxide released into the air above it has risen from 25 to 60 million tons. And that, they agree, is roughly equivalent to Europe's increased use of fossil fuels. But they insist that Norway's salmon population, for example, had started dropping long before then, possibly as long ago as the 1890s, over a period when Europe's fuel consumption was relatively static. According to Britain, it means that other factors are involved, and that even more research is needed to find out what these are. One likely culprit is the nature of the bedrock. Southern Norway is mainly granite, which contains no calcium carbonate to provide a natural buffer against the acid. The Norwegians don't dispute such facts, but claim they're relatively unimportant in the overall picture. They feel the principle is proved by individual instances, such as the one in January 3 years ago, when 4,000 tons of sulfate dropped on them in 12 days. What they want now are remedies. So what can be done?
We must reduce the emissions of pollution from industrialized areas in general, and this, I think, applies to the whole of Europe. We must do it in Norway, and we have given strict regulations on Norwegian industry to diminish the pollution caused by Norway itself. I think for the cause of all peoples in Europe, for the health and its damage on nature, it is necessary for all countries to make regulations to reduce the total emissions of pollution from industry.
What will be the effect on Norway if this kind of pollution isn't checked?
We know that we will have an increasing area affected by acidity, an increasing number of lakes and fish stocks depleted, and we also fear that we will have long-term effects on the forests of this country, which will cause, of course, even greater economic and ecological changes to Norwegian nature.
Whoever is to blame, there's no doubt that the environment is suffering from acidity, and Norway's got to learn how to minimize the effects. One way it's trying to do so is by a series of controlled forest studies. In this experiment, trees are being sprayed with a solution that's deliberately far more acidic than any possible precipitation. It's being matched by a control experiment elsewhere in the forest using a normal solution. Acid rain is in fact greatly changed by passing through a canopy of forest. Scientists hope that these and similar studies will enable them to predict the effects of the pollution and help them to find the upper limits of nature's tolerance to it. The OECD report may lead to some form of international agreement, but any legislation would be difficult, if not impossible, to enforce, especially on the nations of Eastern Europe. There are economic problems too. Britain, for example, claims that reducing its sulphur emissions by the amount Norway wants would cost a fortune for every trout or salmon saved. So for the moment at least, Norway's pollution problems are far from solved.